Well, I've now been joined by Trevor Phillips, who is the chair of Green Park and also the deputy chair of the National Equality Standards Board. Trevor, it's a pleasure, and it's a change of roles. You're usually interviewing people the other way around.
I try to get out of the habit.
You've just come off the stage at the World Retail Congress here in Amsterdam. You chaired a fascinating panel on diversity. You made a point right at the very end, which I'd like to start with,
Yeah.
Which is if you as an organisation don't think you need to address diversity now, then you've got a big problem. Do you just want to explain what you meant in that in terms of just the time it takes in order to get things done in an organisation?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. We did some work on viewing figures for British TV stations, and everybody knows the BBC brand. It is probably the best-known brand in the world.
Well, indeed, in my youth, you used to appear on it.
Yes, indeed.
Very often.
Yeah, and it is our biggest broadcaster, a terrestrial broadcaster anyway, and it's an important national institution. We always thought it was just that, a national institution. Everybody watched it. It's free, so there's not a price issue as with subscription channels. What we discovered about 3 years ago was that people of colour are about 40% less likely to be watching the main BBC channel and the main BBC news than the average British person. Now, let's leave aside the consequences of that for social cohesion. Just think of it as a commercial proposition. If you discovered that there was a whole chunk of people who basically weren't interested in what you had to offer, even though it's free, you'd start thinking, am I doing something wrong? Now, the problem for the BBC is in order to correct that, for example, they might have to make some different kinds of programs. Well, the lead time for making, a big new series is probably 4 or 5 years. To create new stars, it probably takes 20 years. So in order to make up for that deficit, it's probably going to take the corporation 10 years. And during that 10 years, Sky, Netflix, Amazon, Apple are eating their lunch. So the point I was really trying to make is, do not imagine this is something that you can deal with tomorrow. You've got to deal with it today. And a second example is of a very big entertainment and leisure organisation in the UK, turns over about £500 million a year. We worked out for them that right now, if they were able to appeal to minority consumers as effectively as they do to others, they would be making something like £45 million a year more than they do. Their opportunity cost is about 45 million. But what is more important is that the demographics in the UK are such that that slice of their potential audience is growing. So by the middle of the century, the opportunity cost to them will be over 100 million in today's prices. Now, in order to fix that, they've got to start working out what to do now. They can't wait till 2050 to get that money back. They've got to start thinking, what sort of attractions do we put on now? How do we change our language? How do we change our appeal? So my general point is, get on with it.
Now, you've spoken, I suppose, about two sort of areas. There's the commercial aspect of it, and there's the societal impact and issues related to social cohesion. Should organisations be looking at both of those, or in a commercial organisation, should you just be looking at the commercial aspects of why it's important?
Well, the thing is that the commercial success of particularly retail enterprises isn't just about price. It isn't even about just about product availability. Increasingly, it is about the extent to which the consumer identifies with your brand. And we see this a lot in the fast-moving consumer goods territory, but I think it's true in entertainment and media. I think it is probably true even in grocery. Does the consumer feel that you, as a brand, reflect what sort of person they are. You know, I was associated for some years with one of the most powerful British brands, which is John Lewis. Our grocery chain is Waitrose. And if you talk to any British person, everybody knows what Waitrose means. Waitrose is aspirational, it's middle class, it's nice. And one of the reasons that Waitrose customers will pay a premium is because they want to feel that they are Waitrose kinds of people. Now, I think retailers can both get the benefit of that, and they can also see the downside of it. If they are smart enough, as, for example, some of the cosmetics companies are, to pay clear attention to both the age demographics, the ethnic demographics, the geography of their customers, and market themselves in a way that takes account of that, then they benefit. If, on the other hand, they do things like some retailers do, which is not train their staff to take cognizance of people's difference, so you get the sort of terrible situation where Oprah Winfrey gets asked, "Do you have enough money, madam?" Yes. Because the person in the store thinks, well, black lady, who knows, kind of thing. You can crash your brand if you don't pay attention to these things.
So what's the glide path? What should organisations be doing in order to put themselves in the right place in the next few years?
Well, I think that the fundamental point about all of this is that companies have to think of this as they do any other business problem. What do we know? What don't we know? Can we get the data? Can we get insight? And can we get advice from outside to help us? Do we need to vary the composition of our staff to make sure that we've got the right reflexes? You know, a company that sells stuff to women, which is run by all men knows that it's going to be in trouble. Similarly, in relation to ethnicity, Sinead Burke was talking, I thought, incredibly persuasively about the importance of understanding the needs of what we call people with disabilities, smaller people, people who don't have a particular limb and so on. Understanding those markets, incredibly important. I think what it comes down to for me is that senior leaders have to take responsibility for this issue as much as they do with others. And they need to make sure that their enterprises are across the data, that they have properly analysed it and have good insights, and that they are positively acting. They're not just making sure they don't get themselves in trouble, but that they are acting positively to make sure that they're competitive. As somebody said to me recently, we've realised that if we don't have a diversity strategy, we don't have a growth strategy. And that, I think, is a thing that senior leaders particularly have got to get through their own heads and then communicate to their staff.
Well, I think that's a very important point. Finally, Trevor, in the relationship between legislation and what companies should do because it's the right thing to do, what's the balance between those two things? I mean, you've been on both sides of that particular fence.
Well,
argument, maybe.
Yeah. In general, I do not favour using legislation to beat up private enterprise. I mean, I spent most of my life in the private sector. I think, by and large, we do things that are good for people. However,
sometimes people need a bit of a nudge, don't they? Or no?
Yeah, sometimes I think what happens is that in the commercial world, we think stuff's going to happen because it will happen, and that we don't really need to act positively. That isn't always the case, and certainly what is the case is that quite often we don't act soon enough. My point is that, you know, in some sectors, what is happening is because people haven't paid attention to, for example, the differing tastes of millennials, of young people, they're suddenly discovering that their product is no longer useful or usable, and it's going to take them a lot of time and money to catch up, which they wouldn't have needed to spend if they'd thought about it before. So I think that the point is that commerce, generally speaking, gets it right, but sometimes it needs the spur of legislation, and sometimes it needs facility. So, for example, I think that the most important thing that has happened pretty much anywhere in the diversity space in the UK was legislation that we introduced in 2010, which enforced transparency about pay so that people could ask their employer to provide them with information about what their peers were earning. And this made a huge difference to the position on women's pay, because previous to that, women didn't know.
Yeah.
Now, actually, we're taking it a step further. So companies have to publish their data on pay gaps. And that, I think, is going to revolutionise the treatment of women, particularly at senior levels, in almost every enterprise in the United Kingdom.
Well, Trevor Phillips, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed
My
for talking
pleasure.
to us.
Thank you.